This is a lecture I called On the Steps Running Towards Fascism. I wouldn't go with the pun steps towards fascism because it's not appropriate to the severity and earnestness of the subject. But to establish a sense of place, I'm going to begin with 5 minutes of classical music. The composer Alexander Borodin was also a chemist, and one of the more beautiful pieces of music out of the 19th century, which some have compared to Copland and his music that also describes the landscape of America, the wide open plains, the prairies, the steppes, and so forth. So just take some time to listen to this to get a sense of place before I go into the lecture. So why are we talking about Central Asia? Because in one of the big controversies about the meaning and nature of the Holocaust, the German historian Ernst Nolte set off the Historikerstreit, the historians' controversy of 1986 and 87, with the thesis, and he was just asking questions, at the time, whether the Holocaust was not an Asiatic deed, whether not the Gulag was the primary cause of Auschwitz, whether perhaps the class murder that the Bolsheviks committed predates logically and in time the race murder committed by the fascists. Other historians had similar approaches to re-evaluating the Nazi regime and the Holocaust at the time. Michael Stürmer, for instance, demanded that history serve as a positive point of identification for the nation. There was a sense that was distilled into the phrase that we need to be able to be proud to be Germans again. Stürmer had directly been involved with the Christian Democratic Party as a speechwriter, I believe. Andreas Hillgruber wrote about the last months and weeks on the Eastern Front, gave an account of the defensive struggle of the crumbling Wehrmacht at the time, and came to the conclusion that, considering the barbaric violence visited upon populations that came under Soviet control, justified the viciousness of the defensive struggle. He didn't use the term barbaric hordes, but it was clear enough that his language and his imagery, as well as his reliance on primary sources and memories, was shaped almost exclusively by fascist war propaganda throughout, which just heated up all the more towards the end. So a considerable portion of the very last official German government newsreel, you know how for every movie performance you get a prior newsreel, half of it was dedicated to interviews with women who were not describing, but hinting at the fact that they had been raped by Russian soldiers, and also variations on the theme of saying these are not really soldiers, they're more like wild animals. Of course, this was the drumbeat of propaganda towards the end of the war. Protect your women and children. When the Russians get their way with them, there's absolutely, you will not be able to live with yourself. You have to give your life at this point or else. You know, because I showed you that even in 1933, Hitler, speaking to the generals, had already known this, had already said this, and had said this is the justification for going to war. The Russians, the communists, they are barbaric. They are not really fully human. They are not really fully equals as comrades on the battlefield, as worthy adversaries. They are like an illness, like some kind of infestation that has to be killed. So, and if you take that at face value, you might come to Hillgruber's conclusion that yes, indeed, the Holocaust was dictated to us by the barbaric Soviets. We were just doing what we feared they would do to us. This is missing the part of the argument where we feared that they would do to us because we've been doing it to them, and we've been claiming they would do that, and we've been wanting to do it to them all along. Nowadays, this has become, in many ways, the mainstream. In the 1980s, this was the bourgeois conservative, respectable historians mainstream. Now, you might be asking, where were the liberal historians? This is Germany in the 1980s we're talking. There are no liberal historians. In my career as a student, undergraduate and master's in Germany, there were professors who were liberal, but they were almost never tenured. Wolfgang Wippermann, for instance, extremely important historian of fascism, was working as an honorary lecturer Like he did not even get paid. He could do that because his wife was a doctor at the university hospital. And the only places really that had some pockets of historical, of left-wing historians or even liberal were Bremen and Bielefeld, where you had universities that were specifically founded by social democrats after the war in the 1960s to actually change up the university landscape. Other than that, German academia was pretty arch conservative. Now, among those, Nolte had actually been one of the first and most ruthless in actually addressing the Nazi past and trying to come to terms with it. So, nevertheless, this was a fairly broad-based attempt by conservative groups in Germany, mainstream conservative groups, to reevaluate the past. Jürgen Habermas, the philosopher who was trained by Adorno and Horkheimer, although he doesn't see eye to eye with them on many issues, was the main person who to organize the answer to these theses. And he criticized the desire for a positive national identity in the first place, especially since it always comes with this, in spite of National Socialism. We really need to be proud again to be Germans. We can't be thinking about this forever. We have to move past it. He criticizes these mainstream historians for relativizing the Holocaust. It is no longer a uniquely German, a uniquely barbaric act. It becomes something that is somehow explicable, perhaps justifiable. Maybe there are some good reasons why they had to do that. Perhaps you would have done the same thing had you been in their situation. No, there is absolutely no path to that conclusion. It is a uniquely evil and incomprehensible, incomparable event. That is not to say that there are not precedents for torture, cruelty, mass murder, and so forth. But there is absolutely no way that you can say, well, this is just in the nature of A, humanity in general, which is the blanket excuse for anybody who doesn't want to hear about inhumanity, or B, inherent in something that is non-European, Asian, barbaric. Finally, in their open anti-communism, in their assumption that the Soviets are up to no good, and wherever you get Soviet rule, you get oppression, these Western conservative historians were also immediately channeling the Nazis and the foundations of their political program. Anti-communism was foundational for the Nazi political program. Whether in some historians' formulations, it wasn't Marxism that was the root of all evil, but modernity is almost interchangeable. By modernity, we mean secularization, democratization, technological progress, and so forth. But that too has overtones of a reactionary nostalgia, because what is pre-modern, what is non-modern, what is anti-modern, it is usually all these things the Nazis like. The unrefined hierarchical relationships between people that are organically linked because of their blood and soil and their belonging to the community, where values are not questioned and where authority is ruling without contradictions. So all this taken together is not just channeling, legitimizing, relativizing the barbarism of the Nazi regime and the deliberate, planned, logical consequence that this barbarism constituted from out of the ideology of the regime. It also is inching closer in rejecting Marxism to throwing out liberalism and the whole age of revolution, because these, liberalism and Marxism, in many ways share a whole lot of common foundations, as historians will always point out. As conservatives will always point out, much to the consternation of liberals. But if you're going there and saying, the whole project of the Enlightenment, the whole project of trying to liberate humanity from arbitrary authority and the mute compulsion of nature, the being stuck in and having to be tossed around by accidental events that are handed to us by nature, as opposed to being in charge of our destiny as a species. That these attempts at democracy and shaping the world after a rational plan were already the path toward damnation and toward barbarism, because utopia is evil inherently, according to some conservative ideologues. Yes.
So these three historians, Nolte, Hill, Gruber, and Habermas, are they at odds with each other?
The first three were making similar points, which Habermas then, in an article, kind of synthesized and said this is all the same sauce, basically. They're all drawing on the same font of revisionism. So Habermas is the liberal critic. He is, in fact, a philosopher, not a historian. There were some historians, too, who spoke out, but the main conceptual counter proposal was Habermas's. So, and for him, what is Germany all about? Because that was the question, and he accepts that. So he's nationalist enough to accept that Germany is about something, and what that something is about has something to do with Germany. So that's inherently a nationalist proposition in the first place. And accepting that, he says, okay, we need something to rally around that defines us. And what we want to go with is what he called a constitutional patriotism. We want to identify with our nation because it is defined by the freedoms and rights that come from having this particular constitution, a constitution. And this will then connect to the positive traditions of the German democratic movement, the revolutionary tradition, humanism, the Enlightenment, all those kinds of good things. Through that, we are connected to Western liberalism. There's a reason why we're part of this alliance of NATO with the United States, France, Britain, and others, because we share the same values. In distinction to what is out there in the world, perhaps as values that are reactionary, that are not democratic, not enlightened, pluralistic, and so forth. So it's not like Habermas is in the business of justifying communism. He is not in the business of defending the Soviet Union. He is trying to fill the anti-communist world alliance, the NATO, with a different liberal Western content. And so the Enlightenment specifically, this idea that, yes, you want to criticize false ideas, false authority. You want everybody to have an equal right and an equal capacity to participate in public discourse. You want to have a public discourse that is free from domination, where nobody dictates what the truth and what the correct outcome will be from the start. That is our project. That's what we're in it for. So it's the opposite of what the Nazis wanted, and that could be who we are. There is a certain irony in this, because nowadays this has become the foundation. Like if you hear a German official speak, or somebody who sees themselves as speaking in any kind of capacity where they have a feeling, I'm going to be perceived as speaking for Germany, keep a score how many times they say Enlightenment. There was a talk I didn't go to when I lived on the East Coast. A friend of mine went there, the German ambassador spoke, and I said, did you talk about the Enlightenment? And the person was surprised, because yes, that was the first thing he talked about. And nobody quite understood that, because nobody at that time among American intellectuals considered the Enlightenment to be a good thing. They had all been Foucault-pilled, where the Enlightenment is actually, just like the Nazis argue, the root of all evil and leads you down the road to institutions, panopticons, prison complexes, and so forth. So, but that's a different subject, how post-structuralism has made fascist arguments more respectable, and in fact, fully accepted to the point of being dogma among liberals. So anyways, Habermas is basically the state the state conscience of Germany, the national conscience of Germany. I've already put, well, if ever he dies, already put my name in to become the next Habermas. We'll see how that goes. But nowadays, no German was able to say we're going to bomb Belgrade back into the Stone Age during the Balkan crisis, for instance, without putting in a couple of asides where this is done for the Enlightenment, and because we are so conscious of the duty that comes from this horrific past of ours. So this time it's different. When we're bombing the Slavic country into oblivion, we're doing it because of the Holocaust. You know, we're not doing it as a Holocaust, but because it is our duty to do this so that we prevent others from doing another Holocaust. Yeah, right. So this argument, the historian Adam Sachs, writing in Jacobin magazine, recently wrote a pretty good polemic. This argument has gone fully mainstream among respectable American historians. I suspect that in Germany, there is still considerable resistance to mainstreaming this kind of view, that the Russians are the bad guys because they are just so Asiatic. They are just so barbaric. But Timothy Snyder in particular, who is one of the experts, along with Anne Applebaum, on the Soviets and all the evil they did in Eastern Europe, are mightily channeling the anti-communist propaganda of World War I and the interwar period. Did you have a question? Or?
So from what I understand, reading this, Germany pretty much borrowed the ideas of Stalin and his regime as a model.
No, that is what Nolte is arguing. Nolte is saying Stalin showed them how it's done, and then they just did it. What I'm saying is that the presumed atrocities and the barbarism of the Soviets / Russians served the Nazis as legitimization, as justification for doing what they were going to do anyway. So I question the truthfulness of the account that says the Soviets were in it to slash, burn, and murder. I do not find that justified by the historical record. And so the few remaining historians who challenge at great risk to their career the narrative that Snyder and Applebaum and others like them put out there is that these are historians who have basically mainstreamed among American liberalism the right-wing position in the historical strike, which is to say that really whatever people did on the German side, including the Allies in Ukraine and Poland, in Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, and Finland, whatever the Germans did was equivalent to what the Soviets did. In many cases, whatever the Germans did had been done by the Soviets in the same spot before and worse. And so the people who fought as partisans, Jewish, communists, and just plain old peasants who wanted to fight back, who joined partisans that were aligned with the Soviet Union, suddenly become villains. And the actions of the occupying forces of the Germans who raise whole villages in their anti-partisan activities suddenly become merely another contribution to the general mayhem rather than a very specific and unconscionable act of a war crime. So the point of departure to say, but the Soviets were pretty bad in their own right, is always going to amount to saying, and maybe the Germans were not quite as bad. So in praxis, that means that in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, Poland, the Lenin statues are coming down and the Bandera statues are going up, and the ones that are, equivalent to local fascists who eagerly supported the Nazis. And in many cases were worse once they signed up for the SS. So the argument that there were two genocides, that the Holodomor preceded as an act of barbarism the Holocaust, that the fascists merely responded in kind, that it's really kind of unfair to call them fascists in the first place, because after all, you're dealing with a ruthless and barbaric adversary. That is a racialization. And it is also saying that, like Hitler said in 1932, you're not dealing with legitimate opponents in combat. You're dealing with people who need to be wiped off the map, who have to be ended. So in this sense, Western liberalism returns home by saying that anybody who opposes Russian or other Asiatic barbarians is a good guy, is by definition a Western liberal, and therefore Mr. Hitler can now come home to join the resistance because he fought the good fight. We're not saying that yet. But in these countries located in what Snyder called bloodlands, there, the leading political currents are saying that. And if they're putting back up statues or if they're outlawing commemorations of Soviet victories over the Nazis, because they're saying the Soviets were just as bad. That is essentially saying that we're not picking sides. The Nazis were not worse than the Russians. And that is to pick the side of the Nazis. So what about this idea that barbarism is something that is non-Western and that we have to fight against? What about this idea that to deal with that, you really have to put down the hammer and you have to make an example of whole peoples? What about, in other words, about genocide? When it comes to the way that the liberal, civilized West looks at the rest of the world, it is not just the Soviet Union. It is not just communism. It is not just Asia that is treated as barbarian, as not fully civilized and not fully human. It is also Africa, and it is before that the Americas. If you want to look at occasions where there were, if you're looking for primary acts, if you're looking for original sins of modern mass murder, you don't have to go only as far back as, say, the shooting of a few thousand kulaks or the establishment of camps in the Soviet Union. You can easily go back further to the genocide of Native Americans, or in more recent memory, the various acts of the 1870s and 80s where European colonizers let millions of people die, for instance, in India, or actively murdered whole tribes in Africa. So I mentioned already the 1904 Ferrero uprising against German colonial rule, where settler colonialists were taking grazing land that these peoples used for their cattle and converted that into farmland to exclude the nomadic cattle herders when they came to these parts. And because that led to conflict, often violent or armed conflict, then the narrative was one of, look at these barbarians who don't respect private property rights and who want us gone and who want to kill us, even though we're the ones who are making good use of the land. And what is more civilizing than to make good use of the land? That is what the meaning of culture is in the first place, of cultivation. So what can we do if we want to address this menace, but end it once and for all? So the German army there herded these groups of people into the desert where they were left to die. Knowingly saying you're going to be out there in a place that has no water whatsoever and you can't leave. And the response to that politically, when liberals and socialists in Germany got wind of this, spoke up, threatened the funding of the colonies and the colonial troops. Reactionaries, conservatives, etc., who are saying, oh, now look at this, liberals and Marxists are also on the side of the barbarians. This is a threat that is also at home now. The spirit, the barbaric spirit of the Africans has infected the West, and it is present here in the form of liberalism and Marxism. So This then becomes, of course, an important part of the thinking of fascism that we've already seen. But it's also, there's a training ground for that. There are specific things people do that lead them to that political view. And this is one of them. And the people who come back from that war, these colonial troops, and as I've mentioned before, are the ones who then go to town on Democrats, socialists, communists in Germany during the revolution of 1918 and 1919. And I showed you the picture of the black man in the motor vehicle who is part of the East African, this is West Africa, Southwest Africa, of the East African colonial group fighting against German socialists with his leader, whose troop, of course, was 90% African. If you're looking for places where the systematic annihilation of whole groups of people was justified and practiced with German involvement, with German military involvement, you might also look to Armenia in 1915. Germans were involved with the Ottoman army at every level. And of course, this is not an Asiatic deed, if you will, in that the Ottomans were Muslims and whatnot. This is very much a deed that falls into the European cultural orbit because the leadership at this time, the political leadership at this time of the Ottoman Empire was already working toward modernization, creating a nation state after a Western model, meaning you would want to create ethnic and religious homogeneity. So that is something that the Germans well understood who worked with the Ottomans. It wasn't like that they thought, oh, the Armenians are Christian and we are too. You really shouldn't be butchering them. No, they thought this makes perfect sense because what the ticket is to have a uniform, homogeneous people in a contiguous territory. That's how you make a state. And that's if you want to be a competitive member of the international order, as opposed to a failing multiracial and multi-ethnic and cultural empire like the Ottomans had been, that's the ticket. In the Ottoman genocide of Armenians too, herding people into the desert to leave them to die was a major tactic of genocide. Like in the Syrian desert along the upper, I want to say Tigris River, Deir Azor is the place where thousands of people were sent to die. In the dealings of Germany, really going back a long time, but especially when it comes to the exploitation of Slavic landed labor landed laborers rather, east of the Elbe River, there has been a long history of settler colonialism. And when the opportunity presented itself in 1918, after the collapse of the Russian army, after the October Revolution, German troops occupied Ukraine. They had been invited to do that by an anti-communist government in Kiev, which promised Germany, I hope I have the number right, but I think it translates to 1 million bushels of wheat. Because, after all, Ukraine is known as the breadbasket of Europe. The quality of the soils, the climate, etc., has made it since the 1870s equal only to the Great Plains of North America as a supplier of wheat in particular. So when these deliveries of wheat were not forthcoming, the German military leaders convinced themselves what they already believed was justified, that you had to directly colonize this place, that the local peasantry was not going to cut it because they didn't have, racially what it takes to really make productive use of the land. And this is a motif you have always again and again when it comes to land grab, when it comes to settler colonialism. Even this was the figure of thought we were told as school children in Germany why it was justified for Israel to displace Palestinians, because the Israelis are making good use of the land. The Palestinians weren't really doing anything with it. So since then, I have come to be a little more skeptical of that argument. So Ludendorff, of course, becomes a major figure in the Nazi movement when he returns. And the idea that pushing east as an outlet for the social question, a settlement room for a country, for a people without room, that was the title of a book that was popular in the 1920s, was going to be the way. And when they said that, they thought about Poland, they thought about Ukraine, and ultimately Russia proper. So they had the steppes of Central Asia on their mind. One of the people who were especially ruthless, when you're talking about soldateska, when you're talking about troops that murder, pillage, burn down whole villages, herd people together to send them into some inhospitable place to die, with complete disregard for humanity, then this guy is probably the gold standard. I've mentioned him before. The Baron Roman von Ungern-Sternberg was a Baltic, Estonian, Russian military leader of German ethnic background. So these are the regions on the Baltic coast that were initially conquered by the Teutonic Knights, a crusader order that went to town on the Slavic populations on the Baltic coast, and hence, still in World War I, all the way to World War II, the landed elite in these places was largely ethnic German. Since these places belonged to the Russian Empire, however, they owed fealty to the Tsar, and as good nobles, they fulfilled that duty. So when World War I came around, although von Ungern-Sternberg at the time was in Paris, he hurried to make his way back to Russia so he could join the Tsar's armies and fight against the Germans. When the October Revolution happened, he was in East Asia along the railroad, the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and he organized a part of the White Russian campaign to defeat in the Civil War the new Soviet government. In this fight, he distinguished himself through excessive brutality. And when he was asked by the Polish traveler Ferdynand Ossendowski, who came to Ungern-Sternberg's headquarters while he was governing Mongolia in 1920, where he was waiting for an opportunity to go back into Russia with an invasion force, said that we are not fighting a political party, but a sect of murderers of all contemporary spiritual culture. Why do the Italians execute the Black Hand Gang, basically blackmailers, mafiosi? Why are the Americans electrocuting anarchist bomb throwers? And I am not allowed to rid the world of those who would kill the soul of the people. I, a Teuton, descendant of crusaders and privateers, I recognize only death for murderers. So the idea here is you're not dealing with people. You're dealing with an infestation. You're dealing with something that is inherently going toward basically genocide, because you're killing the soul of a people. You're getting rid of the Orthodox priests. You're getting rid of the old nobility. What are you putting in place? Communist functionaries who tell the people that they have rights, interests, and so forth, and that they should organize to fight for them. So in what Ungern-Sternberg's marauding bands wrought in the steppes of Central Asia is not very far from what is depicted here in a Soviet propaganda postcard. Rather than let grain fall into the hands or any other food stores of the Soviets, they would burn it. Rather than have able-bodied men join the Soviet army, they would murder them or force conscript them and just murder the women and children. So this was, in Ungern-Sternberg's case, a multi-ethnic and multi-racial coalition. He had Tibetan, Chinese, Bojar, Russian, groups. I want to say he had Japanese aviators, and he, of course, himself was a German, who was a Russian noble who had converted to Buddhism at one point. So what united all of that was the belief that communism is evil. So here they were in Central Asia fighting the Asiatic menace of communism. The Red Army captured and conquered, and defeated Oman Sternberg in 1921 and executed him in September of that year. In Central Asia, this was a democratizing and civilizing force against the barbarism of anti-communist marauders. These are the people who liberated Auschwitz. And the Nazis of all shades will never forget the Soviets for freeing Europe from fascism with the help of Asians, Africans, and others who they had long considered less than them. After justifying what they were doing to their own people and to other people with some amorphous notion that it's barbarism and the others are doing it, we have no choice to defend ourselves and the soul of our people than by butchering a few millions here and a few millions there. Oda Equiano, writing from the inside perspective of a slave in the 18th century, had pointed out, and Hegel picked this up, that the colonizer, in the acts of brutality and barbarism, the slaveholder, in his mistreatment of the slave, bends, tortures, and poisons his own soul and conscience. And that whatever in this moment of primitive accumulation, where extra-European land and labor is exploited for gain, this is what makes Europe so uniquely prone to violence, genocide, etc. So don't talk to me about the Asians. Don't talk to me about the Africans who want to do these things to you. That sounds like a whole lot of projection, if you ask me.
Throwing green open fields, throwing plain wide open prairie. Eagles go riding across the prairie. Yes, we'll Your eyes, hands upon the road we follow. Look and see how it goes. Look and see how the road goes. Wipe away the teardrops. So sing together loud. Sing with us. Falling star, falling star, sing falling.
Unfortunately, we're out of time for this, but let me just wrap this up by saying that the idea, and of course, the reason I'm playing you Paul Robeson again, doing this particular song is one, you get to hear what the English language translation is, and two, once again, a reminder that he considered, like many others in America, the struggle against segregation and racism in the United States to be one that was anti-fascist. So you're looking for primary acts of the Holocaust, you're looking for inspiration for the Holocaust, look no further than the colonial practice of Europeans in Asia and in Africa. It is very much a European deed, and the savagery is all our own, speaking as a European here. If there was one force in the 20th century that stood against that barbarity, it was communism. Not to say that, Stalin is a hero that we should all worship, but you should give credit where credit is due to the Russian communists and others like them for standing up against some of the worst butchers in the history of this planet and of our species.